Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I have the awesome opportunity to give this week's Torah portion. My name is Escobedo, and this is also my first time giving this week's Torah portion. I'm also very ecstatic to be able to share this. This is something that was very meaningful for me, so I also want to say thank you for listening and enjoy. Before I begin, how many people have read this week's Torah portion? Okay, a few of you? Okay, cool. So just like Brother Andy does, I'm going to read from the Chabad website because I think they do an awesome job of giving a summation of what's in store for within this Torah portion. Just because I'm not going to be going through every little thing, but just so that you guys can have an overview of what is. So let me bring that up. So Shoftim, which is Deuteronomy 16:18 through 21:9. Moses instructs the people of Israel to appoint judges and law enforcement officers in every city. Justice, justice you shall pursue. He commands them, and you must administer it without corruption or favoritism. Crimes must be meticulously investigated and evidence thoroughly examined. A minimum of 2 credible witnesses is required for conviction and punishment. In every generation, says Moses, there will be those entrusted with the task of interpreting and applying the laws of the Torah. According to the law that they will teach you and the judgment they will instruct you, you shall do. And you shall not turn away from the thing that they say to you, to the right nor to the left. Shoftim also includes the prohibitions against idolatry and sorcery, laws governing the appointment and behavior of a king, and guidelines of the creation of cities of refuge for the inadvertent murderer. Also set forth are many of the rules of war, the exemption from battle for one who has just built a home, planted a vineyard, married, or is afraid and soft-hearted, the requirement to offer terms of peace before attacking a city, and the prohibitions against wanton destruction of something of value, exemplified by the law that forbids to cut down a fruit tree when laying siege. In this context, the Torah makes the famous statement, "For man is a tree of the field." The Parsha concludes with the law of the Egla Arufa, the special procedure to be followed when a person is killed by an unknown murderer and his body is found in a field, which underscores the responsibility of the community and its leaders, not only for what they do, but also for what they might have prevented from being done. All right. And again, if you haven't read it, I do suggest that you go back and do it for yourself. Anyways, Shoftim, which means judges, is something that I'm going to be primarily focusing on because I think it has a vital importance as us being grafted into Israel and what the roles that the judges actually play for us and their importance. And so, just as a recap, back in the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, Moshe retells the children of Israel that they're to appoint judges. And the judges are, he tells us that the children of Israel themselves choose men of wisdom and understanding to be these judges, right? This is in chapter 113. And remember, this is Moshe talking here to the children of Israel. So if you don't know that already, it's just spoiler alert. But so everything's coming from Moshe himself, and nothing is coming from God directly. So he's also not allowed to enter the land, so he spends a lot of the time rebuking the children of Israel for their behavior. And he's also repeating many of the commandments that God has given the children of Israel already. And so at this point, the children of Israel were giving him such complaints and heartache that he wasn't able to do it all by himself. So this is where his father-in-law Yithro, back in Exodus 34, actually makes the suggestion to make leaders because he says that thing that you're doing is not good, right? He was trying to handle everything all by himself, and there were so many Israelites just to do that by yourself is completely just insane. It's just no one could do that. Even Moshe couldn't do that. So why would we try to do that? But so his father-in-law, right, and then Yithro makes the suggestion that what we need to do is make these judges, appoint these judges. And these judges are then set up, and their function is basically to resolve disputes between brothers. Disputes about what? Disputes about Torah. And in other words, these judges are to resolve questions of halakha that come up within the nation of Israel. And if the arguments were then too difficult, then they went back to Moshe himself. And so what we have here is a line of leadership and Moshe, which is solving these arguments, which I'm going to focus on a little bit later. But this became the way of a judicial system which actually ended up being divided into 3 levels. You have the first court, the appellate court, and the Supreme Court, which is also cool because that's where we have our U.S. government, where the U.S. government actually got their judicial system today. But that's the theme. So if everyone can turn to Deuteronomy chapter 16, I'm going to start at the beginning of this Torah portion, which is starting at verse 18. I'll give you time to turn there. So I'm going to be reading from the Jewish Publications translation. And the Torah portion actually begins with Moses' recap regarding the appointment of judges. So again, that's chapter 16, starting at verse 18. And it says, Judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, tribe by tribe, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. Thou shalt not wresh judgment, thou shalt not respect persons, neither shalt thou take a gift, for a gift doth blind the eyes of the wise, and pervert the word of the righteous. Justice, justice shalt thou follow, that thou mayest live and inherit the land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Now, here in verse 20 contains, I'm going to stop there. In verse 20, it actually contains a very important commandment in all of Torah, well, other than the Shema, of course. Interestingly, this commandment is translated in different ways. If you're reading in the King James Version, it will say, that which is altogether just shalt thou follow. And in Hebrew, which is better yet, a better understanding of the actual translation, it says, Sedek, Sedek, Tirdof, which, as I translate it, could be read as justice, justice, you shall follow. And the reason it's translated justice is because, well, in the context, we're reading about judging between people, right? Moses just got done commanding judges what not to do. He told them you can't go doing around what you want to do. You can't favor some people over other people, and you can't take money as bribes. You just got to treat the people the same, not differently. Just because someone has more money doesn't mean that you rule in their favor, or just because somebody's poor, you don't rule in their favor either. So, and that's the Peshat level of the understanding. That's the basic understanding of what he's trying to say to them. He's basically relaying that you cannot let that stuff come to influence your judgment, period. Justice, justice, you shall pursue. However, in the Drash, in verse 20, there's a deeper meaning of the text for the word tzedek, which is not normally translated as justice, which would be shifut or mishpat, which would be justice, coming from the root shofet, meaning judge. And if anyone speaks Hebrew or knows enough Hebrew, they would know that that's not tzedek, right? So why does it say tzedek, which the normal translation would be? Does anyone know? Righteousness, right? So alternatively, you could read it as righteousness, righteousness, you shall follow, or you shall pursue. These two translations actually mean vastly different things. Justin, can you turn me down just a little bit? So, thank you. So alternatively, yeah, you could read it as righteousness, righteousness, you shall follow. These two translations actually mean two different things. Righteousness is a much broader term than justice, because righteousness has to do with your relationship with God, whereas justice has to do with your relationship with another individual, right? Your brother, your mother, your neighbor, and regarding torts and lawsuits with the hope of resolution. So both are equally important, but righteousness actually covers both. In itself is the definition that covers both your relationship with God and your relationship with another individual. There's more involved here than just the lawsuits and torts. Tzedek can mean justice or righteousness, which is part of the reason why there's differences in the translations. So we must ask ourselves, what's the meaning of this text? What's the context here? So if you look at verse 19, it continues with the commandment that we should not pervert justice. However, the word for justice or judgment, depending on your translation, used in verse 19 is the word mishpat in Hebrew, which is not the same word that's used in verse 20. So clearly there's a deliberate difference in between justice in verse 19 and justice in verse 20. So since tzedek is intentionally different in verse 20 from mishpat in verse 19, we can conclude that verse 20 must mean righteousness rather than justice. Righteousness, so since it's intentionally different, we understand that it should be read as righteousness, righteousness you shall follow, right? Justice is not really the focus of intent, righteousness is. We are to follow righteousness. And the method through which we are to pursue righteousness when there's any type of doubt, conflict, or misunderstanding is through the judges. And so through resolution, it's important to see that these judges are to interpret justice between people and righteousness of God's commandments. And it's by the interpretation of the Torah in order for us to follow righteousness. So even in the chapter, Deuteronomy 17, the next chapter, if you look at, there's another part where it kind of talks again about the appointment of judges. I believe it starts at verse 8 through 12. But in 11, it's still concerning the judges, and the Torah assures us, saying, according to the law which they shall teach thee, and according to the judgment which they shall tell thee, thou shalt do. Meaning, God does not dictate to the individuals within Israel how Torah is to be followed. Rather, Torah is to be interpreted by the judges who are chosen by the children of Israel. Only in this way may we follow righteousness through the judges. And so, at Sinai, as cases are being brought forth and resolved by the judges, case law is then developed, right? And so, as cases are being brought forth, these cases are heard, and every time there's a case, Israel remembers these things. They're not forgotten. So, this is the process of the development of halakha, which continues to be passed down within the children of Israel until the time of Ezra. Long story short, I'm not going to really focus on that. That's a topic for another time. But to be clear, this is not adding to Torah. This is cases involving Torah. So I want to go back to something that I just mentioned earlier, though, referring to the individual, because I believe there's an implication here that gets lost on a lot of people. So right back in Sinai, when the Torah was given brand new to the nation, he didn't give it to us as individuals. God said, it's given to you, plural, the nation of Israel, for you to obey. You, plural, as a nation, right? And further, God commands us very specifically, saying that we're not to follow after our own eyes and after our own heart. And it's actually explicit in the Hebrew. It says, not to prostitute yourselves. And just like Joshua had mentioned a couple Torah portions back, he said, at the root of all disobedience in Torah is idolatry, which is very important. So if you try to make the Torah into something given to you as an individual, you're violating Torah. You could be potentially puffing yourself up, saying, hey, I got the right interpretation. I'm doing it the right way. If you're not doing it this way, then you're wrong, right? You can be putting yourself higher, where the whole idea is that we should be following these mitzvot together as a nation, a unit, right? Unified, and that's one of the most important things. Even Revive stands on that, exactly that, right? As we say, a house divided cannot stand. Seek unity. You guys are awesome, right? Now, this means that we have to have a common interpretation and understanding. So, right, just as the foundation of the nation of Israel, which originated at Sinai, as we know, just didn't happen in one day. It took over a period of 40 years wandering in the desert until they finally came together. And then the task is given to them to finally keep the Torah and walk it out together. So we have to have a common interpretation and understanding. I hope this is making sense. Okay, so if we're all on the same page, we can look at the Torah and we can see that there is 365 negative commandments and there's also 245 positive commandments. Just for example, let's just pick one of these positive commandments. You shall write it on the doorpost of your house and on your gates, right? So how many people have a mezuzah on their house? Right, quite a few of you, right? Because we're commanded, right? We're commanded to write it on the doorpost of your house and on our gates. But what does that have to do with the mezuzah? Like, how do we go from that commandment to getting a parchment paper, writing on it by a scribe, putting that roll into a box, which is the mezuzah, and then putting that onto your doorpost? Like, where is that found in Torah? Like, how do we get from there to there, right? Another one, tzitzit, right? We're told that you shall put fringes at the end of your garments, and there will be a thread of techelet, which is blue. And how do we get from there to these, right? You see people wearing tzitzit all the time. But if you look at them, there's knots on there. There's the color blue, specifically a color blue there, and there's the white. It's like, where is that found in Torah? Now, is this the way to do it correct? Wouldn't you think that because Israel as a nation has decided to do it this way, it's correct? And if you're trying to do it a different way, wouldn't that mean you're rejecting Israel? You're in a way replacing it, right? Because if you can say, well, this is what God meant, and again, like you could be saying, I had the right interpretation, but that's where we get all these divisions. That's why you see that so much in the movement of Israel coming back into Israel, and you still see that even in the Jewish setting. So there are so many divisions, but if you're doing it individually and not as Israel does, all you're doing is separating yourself from Israel, which violates the Torah. Don't do that, because then we start doing what the Torah tells us not to, which is following after our own eyes and after our own heart. Another example, since Sukkot's coming up, if we look at the commandment, it says, we shall dwell in the sukkah for 7 days. The shev besukkah is the Hebrew for you shall dwell in the sukkah. The Hebrew literally means to sit, the shev. So if you take that literal to mean, yeah, we're supposed to go sit in there for 7 days straight on with never coming out or something, like you could take it that way and say, I mean, go for it. You can do that. You can be one of those zealots or someone that's like really devoted. But I would say no. Israel actually interprets that in order to leshev, to sit and fulfill that mitzvah, it means sitting for some period of time by eating something, right? Sit and eat. The sages say that what this means is that the eating of something that forces us is something that forces us to spend some time in the sukkah, to dwell in the sukkah. And guess what? That's correct, because we're doing it together. And so in Torah, there are many commandments that God gave that are left unknown how to do, and the purpose is for Israel to come together and develop a common understanding to perform the mitzvah. Okay, so in conclusion, the Torah command for Israel to determine how to follow the written Torah of Sinai is contained in the command, righteousness, righteousness, you shall follow. And we are to determine how we're to follow the Torah through the system of argument and judges. And these judges, righteous leaders of justice, play an important role throughout the entire history of Israel. In Matthew 23, Yeshua actually confirms that role of the judges in the time that were upheld by the Pharisees and Torah teachers. Yeshua instructs us that they sit in the seat of Moses, be careful to do everything that they say. Right? And Torah is the foundation. Nothing should be ever put above Torah. Right? Amen. And so I'm going to leave you with the final question. How are you, plural, we as a nation of Israel, following Torah? Shabbat shalom. Thank you.